This is a reading of Code Talkers, Chapter 21, Part 2. And the chapter is called Guam. On July 27th, we broke out from our beachheads and began to take back the rest of Guam. On August 10th, we reached the sea at the north end of the island. There would still be weeks of skirmishes ahead, with small groups of enemies still in the hills and jungles, but the battle for Guam was won. As I walked along, the sun was shining, and I could feel a little of that sunshine beginning to warm my heart. We trudged down to Agana, the capital city of Guam. There we set up command posts and a hospital. Little groups of Chamorros who had managed to escape the Japanese began to come back to Agana. They needed help, but were more eager to help us by telling where the remaining Japanese were hiding. Because Guam had been an American island for so long, the Chamorros spoke English as we did. It was heartbreaking for me to hear their stories and see the little children whose families were dead. What happened to those Chamorros and the people on the other islands made me think yet again of what had been done to our Navajo people during the time of the long walk. I wanted to weep for them. It was just as bad for the Chamorros as it had been for us Indians. In fact, grandchildren, I think it was worse for the Chamorros. At least we could run to the hills. The people of those little islands had nowhere to get away. Guam was only 30 miles long and 7 miles wide. Have you ever had a dream where you see a monster but can't move your feet to run away? That's how it was for the Chamorros when the Japanese soldiers came. I tried to do as much as I could, helping them carry their few possessions and sharing my food. Before long, all of us Navajos were bringing the natives right into our chow lines, and no one ever objected. There was one little boy that I will never forget. He was only 7 years old, and his name was Johnny. His whole family had been killed when the Japanese invaded. Our Navajo way is that no child should ever be without a family. So Wilsey Bitsy brought him to our tent and gave him a cot to sleep on. He stayed there while we were out on patrol. He was always waiting for us when we came back, a big smile on his face. He made up a sad little song about what happened to him. On the 8th day of December, my father above took my father and took my mother. He took my sisters and he took my brothers. He took baby Jer, who was only a month old. He took them all and left me by myself, and I have no one to turn to. We took care of little Johnny all the time we were on Guam. When we finally got our orders to pull out, leaving him was like losing a member of our family. Woolsey picked little Johnny up and carried him to the Red Cross aid station. They promised they would make sure that he was placed with a good family. The last thing Woolsey did was give Johnny his address back home so that they could always stay in touch by writing to each other. There was one more story to tell you about Guam, grandchildren. It started out very sad. In those last days of fighting after the Japanese pulled back from the Taiyan airfields on August 7th, our patrols pushed their way through the jungle, pursuing them. Charlie Begay, another of our code talkers, was with a forward patrol that walked into an ambush and was cut to pieces. A few hours later, our unit, which included Woolsey and me, discovered what was left of the patrol. Woolsey found Charlie's body. As he knelt to look at him, I had a hopeless feeling in the pit of my stomach. Charlie's lips were blue and there was no sign of breath. An awful wound, probably from a sword, went from his right shoulder across his neck and chest. Grave registration hasn't been thorough yet, Woolsey said. I could see how upset he was. Charlie had been one of Woolsey's best friends back home. Woolsey took one of Charlie's dog tags and put it into his own pocket. He straightened his friend's body, placed the other dog tag in Charlie's mouth, and tied his mouth shut with a strip of cloth. That was standard procedure to make sure a dead man's identification would not get lost. Then we placed Charlie's body near a log, covered him with leaves and bark, and said a prayer. Later that day, we gave Charlie's dog tag to the CO, who then packed his belongings, wrote a letter to his family, and sent it all home. So when Woolsey left Guam, he was not just leaving behind little Johnny, but also one of the best friends he'd ever had. We all kept thinking about Charlie's death. Weeks later, though, back on the canal, several of us code talkers were sitting around when a Jeep pulled up to our tent. I had just gotten back from a little vacation and was being filled in by the guys about what was new. Leslie, Cody, and I were by the door, and Woolsey was on his cot by the tent flap. We all figured that they were bringing another Navajo to be Charlie Begay's replacement. I walked up to greet him, but when that person who got out of the Jeep turned around, I became speechless. All I could do was stand and stare in shocked silence. Have you been to the land of the devils? Leslie Cody said in a hushed voice in Navajo, as that person, who now had a little smile on his face, stepped past me into the tent. Like me, Leslie was so shocked he couldn't move. Woolsey, though, jumped up and ran over to the man. It was Charlie Begay, dressed in clean new khakis. Ya'a te, Charlie said, his smile greeted even broader. What happened? The last time I saw you, you were dead. Charlie Begay shook his head and looked down at the ground. I don't remember much as anything after the Japanese ambushed us, except I started to feel my feet twitch, and then I heard my heartbeat. It seemed that somebody, he said, looking up at Woolsey, had put bark and leaves all over me. So I started moving to shake that stuff off. Then when I rolled over, I realized that some helpful person had stuck my dog tag into my mouth. And I was not pleased about that. I was just trying to stand up when the Graves registration got to me. Charlie had been evacuated to the hospital ship. He had lost lots of blood and had a big scar, but eventually was recovered enough to report back for duty. We were all overjoyed that day when Charlie came back to life, and Woolsey was the happiest of us all.